His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we are talking about the book of the life of the art of a man. The man is a German immigrant who wound up on Long Island in the late 1800s. His art is a meticulously rendered portrait of Long Island landscapes and buildings and main streets. And the book is the culmination of the painstaking and dedicated work of today's two very special guests.
I'm Lauren Brincat, and I am the Chief Curator and Director of Collections at Preservation Long Island.
I'm Peter Fedoryk. I'm a PhD student at the University of Delaware, and I was formerly the Art of Edward Lange Project Curatorial Fellow.
And that is the man of the hour, Edward Lange. We were just talking, Lauren, you're finishing up the big premiere. Just as a way to just dive in, how's it going? Is it the reception what you expected, or how does it feel to get this finally out in the public?
Yeah, it's so exciting to have the book out. We're working on it for what feels like forever, and we had our launch party this past weekend at a beautiful 1890s home in Northport Village, a place that Edward Lange painted quite a bit, and just had a great crowd there, and people are excited to see the book. It's a really beautiful publication that really shows off Edward Lange's paintings in a wonderful way.
And Peter, how long had you been involved in the project?
I started with Preservation Long Island in July of 2021, just out of COVID. And so it's been about 3.5 years that I've been involved with the project. The origins of the project go back a little further than that even, but about 3.5 years we've been working on this. So it's a little surreal to have the book in hand, to see everything come together. And jumping from text that's drafted in a Word document to the final product that's been beautifully designed, color images laid in, it's a huge jump to that. So it's just having it in hand it's surreal that it's finally reached a conclusion at this point.
At this point, I would imagine, have both of you signed the book at some point for people? That's always a surreal experience.
We have, and we joke every time, we have to do this. We were doing a couple of signings at the party, and that we still don't know how to do this, and they're figuring it out along the way. But it feels, there's a lot of pressure because it's a beautiful book, and don't want to mess up someone's copy with our chicken scratch.
Yeah, I had in mind to come up with a new fancy signature that was clean and something that I could just do quickly for these sorts of things. And that
it's a skill to have, yeah.
Never came together, yeah. So,
well, you'll get more practice, I'm sure. So just to explain it in full, we're talking about promoting Long Island, the art of Edward Lange, 1879 to 1890. And in addition to what other activities are going on in addition to the book launch itself?
Yeah, so to go along with the book, we mounted an exhibition at our museum gallery in Cold Spring Harbor, which is our headquarters, which was actually guest curated by Peter. So it is an exhibition that's open Friday through Sunday that showcases a lot of the paintings that are in the publication and really brings the book to life in a three-dimensional way. So it is an exhibition companion to the book where you can actually, walk through a lot of the content that we explore through the essays in the book and also see the artwork in real life, which is really exciting. And we were able to borrow works from all over Long Island. So to have them all together in one room is really exciting. We had a tour that just happened this past weekend, but we have one other big event that's going to occur on November 16th, which will be an author's talk and then book signing. So that will be in Cold Spring Harbor. We'll all meet at the DNA Learning Center, and we'll have in the room every single contributing author to the publication, and there will be a moderated discussion among all of us. And then we'll head over back to the museum gallery where folks can explore the exhibition, and we'll have a reception and a book signing. So that's really the big exciting event that's going to happen. And it will be the one and only time ever that all of us will be in the same room.
That's great. And we'll get to Edward Lange. So, Peter, we were talking briefly, Lauren and I had found some previous publications from Preservation Long Island on Edward Lange. So there's been a connection with this artist with your institution, but I had never heard of him. So I don't know if you considered him one of Long Island artists' best kept secrets, but who wants to give us some context for the man himself and his work?
Sure, yeah. So I'd never heard of him either when I interviewed for this research position. And I promptly went to the university library and I checked out the only copy of the book that talked about him. Previously, it was written in 1979 by Dean Faley, who was a previous curator for Preservation Long Island. And I read the whole thing and had questions for Lauren about why they wanted to pursue the project. It seems like they already had a book for it. And she quite astutely pointed out that it was a very surface level exploration of his work because it was the first exploration that had been done. And they wanted to dive deeper this time around. And I think that people on Long Island have heard of Edward Lange. Some people who have been following the work that the organization has done over the decades on the artist. But largely he is unknown, I think, to most folks. Definitely outside of Long Island, he's an unknown artist. But he finds a lot of similarities with other peers that have been studied in the art history world. And so it's great to put this book together because we can position this Long Island artist in the same conversation of other folks that have been discussed in more detail and give the context to his life, his work, his art, what it meant during his time and what it means now.
Yeah, and I mean, it was an interesting time. So just from your subtitle, we're talking 1879 to 1890 was his active time on Long Island, right, you would say?
1870 to 1889. Yeah, so 70s and 80s.
And so what it made, I'm not an art historian, so I'll fumble through this, but, what immediately came to mind just from my own background knowledge is Currier and Ives prints and William Sidney Mount. And Edward Lange, will start describing the works, but he painted a lot of landscapes and architecture, houses and buildings, commercial buildings and things. So, like, how would you situate him in the art of the time? Was he a working class artist? Was he aspiring for something greater, or how would you characterize him?
Well, traditionally, Lange's been talked about as this character who immigrated from Germany. He made his way to Long Island. He was a farmer and then was this self-taught artist that decided to transition to art. And that was the tale that had been told about this artist. We uncovered a ton of new research, a ton of new information about his origins in Germany. And it turns out he comes from a highly educated family of German artists. His father ran a print shop in the city of Darmstadt, where he grew up. Two of his uncles, one was a professionally trained architect, and the other was a professionally trained landscape painter, both of whom worked for royal families throughout Europe. So he comes from a very heralded background that we were unaware of in previous research into this artist. So when he comes over to the United States, I wouldn't say he's a working class artist because he does come from a family with a high amount of education and wealth. He's not, I wouldn't say particularly wealthy amongst the folks that are on Long Island. He lives across the street from Carl Burr, and the Burr family was definitely considered a wealthy family at the time. So he's beneath their stature, but he comes with means and he comes with skills. And so he's producing art in the same world, like you said, as Currier and Ives, William Sidney Mount, etc. The kind of art he's making, though, he doesn't base himself out of a print shop the way that Currier and Ives might. They're largely known for their engravings. These are printed engravings that are made in high numbers, high quantities, and circulated relatively cheaply amongst a wide variety of classes of people. And Edward Lange does his best to emulate some of the circulation of artwork that Currier and Ives has, but he's not running a print shop per se. So he's an independent artist, more along the lines of William Sidney Mount, except that Lange doesn't work in oil the way that Mount does. He works primarily in watercolor. And then later in his career, he learns to adopt new photographic technologies to help circulate photographic copies of his work at lower costs than the original watercolors. And so he's tapping into this kind of changing world of art in the 1870s, one that is filled with new technologies, but is very much dominated, like you said, by the paper ephemera producers like Courier Knives.
Yeah, he kind of lives in this space at the nexus of, what Courier Knives is doing and what William Sidney Mountain is doing, which I find really fascinating about Edward Lange.
Yeah, and so Lauren, what strikes you about his paintings, or which ones would you point people to go see when they're walking through the exhibit?
I mean, something that's always been celebrated about Edward Lange's artwork is how wonderfully detailed they are. And in the exhibition, we have a couple of magnifying glasses that people can take and walk around with in the gallery to really look at all of the elements that he includes in his landscapes. And, especially ones of Main Street in Northport, particularly one of Upper Main Street, you see that view and some of the buildings and the monument that's there, you recognize that's still there on the landscape. But this is a landscape filled with a cattle drive and, women and holding parasols and carriages. And so it does take you back to this place that is familiar, but also very different to us. So those are particularly wonderful views that really give us this glimpse into late 19th century Long Island.
Yeah, I like having the magnifying glass because when I was looking at his commercial buildings, so there's a great clarity to his work in terms of capturing every detail and even like the words on the signs on the buildings, which is a treasure trove, I would think, of historical detail and names and what companies were where at what point in time. Is that unique to his style, or at least for that time period on Long Island, that kind of detail?
Well, I think it's a particular part of how he chooses to paint his landscapes. And a lot of these businesses that show up and crop up in these town views and Main Street views that he makes are probably the ones hiring him to make these pictures in the first place. And so a big part of that, the detail of his artwork, is trying to show potential clients that he's going to advertise them in this artwork as well as himself as the artist. And so he kind of two birds, one stone in this situation. He gets to show off how intricate his eye for detail is, and it benefits the people who are paying him to produce these works.
It's kind of like those community maps that you find in different villages where, businesses pay in to have their business located on this map. It's kind of a similar situation that's going on with Edward Lange, but a century earlier.
So that his market was the local businessman that was looking to advertise or promote their locations. And so, I mean, to go back to your title, Promoting Long Island, do you think he was consciously, I'll just throw in another name. I'm thinking of like Hal B. Fullerton and the Long Island Railroad trying to draw in people to Long Island. Mm-hmm. How conscious do you think Edward Lange, other than like, I'm getting paid to do this, was he really thinking, let's make Long Island a destination or something like that?
We don't know a lot about what Edward Lange was really thinking with his art because we don't have a deep archive. But I think, in looking at his art and thinking about this time period, that he was very much aware of this, for example, growing industry of tourism, the growth and expansion of the Long Island Railroad, and that he is a part of all of that's happening, all of these different advertising and business maneuvers to try to get people to settle on Long Island and to come and visit here as a leisure destination. So I think he's very much aware of that and is trying to find a way for him to insert himself into this booming economy and to make a name for himself and to get paid as an artist.
And what I was thinking, so in terms of the larger missions of preservation Long Island and the fact that he was capturing these landscapes, which I would imagine most of them don't exist, in terms of the built environment. So how valuable or how accurate is two different questions, but can you rely on his paintings or do you view them as, beyond just the artwork itself, what they're documenting and the detail they're documenting? Did you see them as valuable historical sources?
Yes. And that is a really good, important question. So I think for people who are researching particular places on Long Island, his artworks really capture in wonderful detail places that actually existed on the landscape. And it's full of all these bits of information that are really, it's a mine really for historians, researchers, people who are interested in all different facets of late 19th century Long Island. And his artwork has always been described as being so photorealistic. But one thing that we tried really hard to do in this publication is to also caution people to not take these artworks at face value, because he is a businessman. He is being hired by people to present a very specific view of life on Long Island during this time. And so these are edited images. They are curated images that are showing things in an intentional way. And so something that we try hard to do is to encourage people to think beyond the edges of the paper and to bring to the surface people or ideas or places that are not being depicted in Edward Lange's artwork. You look at, his body of work from Long Island, and there are only a handful of people of color depicted in any of them. And we know that there were larger communities of color on Long Island. And so something that I explore deeply in the essay that I wrote about the rise of the tourist industry is that he has these really beautiful, pleasing views of people walking around these large hotels, but something you don't see in these pictures are the people who are working at these hotels, the black bellhops, waiters, porters, or the black baseball team, the Cuban Giants at the Argyle, which is something that he also paints. And so that's something to also keep in mind too as you're looking at Edward Lange's artwork, is that this is not a full view of late 19th century Long Island life.
And so in the same vein, are the landscapes a little more primitive? Because I know this was, there was the railroad was branching out, but he doesn't really, I think in the background he's got some train tracks and things, but it's very bucolic in a sense. It's a lot of horses and carriages and farm life. Was he sort of eliding some of that detail, not showing it as I don't know if you can go that far to say that, but was he idealizing it in some sense maybe?
I think absolutely. Thinking, Chris, about you bringing up William Sidney Mount, for example, makes me think about 19th century landscape art as a community of artists who are all constantly inspiring each other in how to produce work and in what styles are acceptable and what's the popular fashion. Now, Lange has a different style completely than William Sidney Mount, but Lange's also not exhibiting his artworks in artists' clubs. He's not exhibiting his artwork in showrooms in New York City, like Mount was and like many other landscape artists were. He's doing it for commercial promotion of his local areas, but he does have his eye towards what's happening in the art scene. And so a lot of how he's composing these landscapes falls into very traditional ways of composing a landscape. It's difficult to portray a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional sheet. And so there's tropes and techniques that he falls into. And some of them are pretty simple techniques, and he's better at some of them, and he's not so good at others. But he works on it, and his style changes dramatically from 1870 to 1889. And a lot of this is because he learns how to use watercolors better to extract emotion from a view, compose his landscapes in ways that show his audience's eyes where to travel around the picture and what to focus on. And so we see a lot of personal evolution in him as an artist over the 20 years he spends on Long Island. And a lot of that, is learning that people like to look at landscapes around Long Island as pastoral, bucolic scenes. And he really leans into that. And I think he gives his audience what they want to see.
Does he make much? I know you talked a little bit about the scarcity of the record, but in his time on Long Island, was he well connected, or did you see any evidence of him in the record from other people's diaries or letters, or that he made an impact or was known?
He appears in a handful of that we've come across, a handful of letter books or signature books that people would carry around and have their friends sign a brief note in when they visited. A handful of them. There's one in the Northport Historical Society's collection that I believe he signed. But really the paper trail of written documentation is extremely thin. And I'll contextualize, Lauren had mentioned that, I'll contextualize that a little more. So he arrives on Long Island in 1870. He leaves Long Island in 1889 and goes to Olympia, Washington, the complete opposite side of the country. And he moves there and he continues making art. He lives there for about another 20 years. He dies in 1912, and the year after that, the family house that they bought over in Washington burns down. And we know this because there's a newspaper article in one of the Olympia newspapers talking about this tragedy. Lange's daughter was there at the time, but couldn't do anything to stop the fire. And the newspaper article specifically mentions that a ton of records from the old artist's life were in the house when it burned. So this oil paintings, watercolors, sketches, sketchbooks, drawings, probably journals, and probably letters. And so all went up in flames. And that's really the archive that would give us a better sense of how connected he was, who he was talking to.
Yeah, we can only clean that off of, whose houses he's painting to get a sense of what his connections were in the community, save for Carl Burr, who was a neighbor and close friend. And the only letter we have written by Lange is one that he sent to Burr from Washington.
But to think of then the paintings as documents, and I'm always fascinated by the survival rate and how material artifacts survive or don't survive. And I don't know, Lauren, you can tell me the history of Preservation Long Island's connection to collecting Edward Lange. But so here's a big picture question. Can you say with whatever level of certainty how many Edward Lange Long Island paintings exist? Or have you done a census of?
We have. So as Peter mentioned earlier, that this project began in 2021 when he joined the staff as our curatorial fellow. And the first thing that he got to work doing was going to every single collection that we could on Long Island to catalog and photograph every single Long Island view by Edward Lange that we could track down, and to put all of that on a website, which is live and folks can go explore on, called The Art of Edward Lange, and it maps all these paintings across the region. So we found approximately there's 150 on there that we know that he painted of Long Island. So he was fairly prolific, and I'm sure there were many more.
And some are owned by Preservation Long Island? You have?
Yeah, so we have nearly 30 works by Edward Lange, and we like to talk about that we acquired the first one in 1968, and it was an albumen photograph, and he would take photographs of his original artworks and then make those available to people at a lower price point so that more people could actually purchase his art. And it's one of Port Jefferson and is the only view that he actually includes himself in the landscape. So that was the very first piece that we acquired in 1968. 10 years later, we did the first book, Edward Lange, Long Island. And since then, we have amassed one of the greatest collections of Edward Lange's Long Island artworks at about 30.
Great. And you mentioned photography, which I wanted to bring in. So obviously photography existed at that point, for a number of decades. And so what was the role of photography, or how much do you know about what drew him to it or how he was using it?
I mentioned that his father ran a print shop back in Germany, and we can suppose that Edward might have worked there as a young boy, learning the trade. Most of the books that his father was producing were volumes of collected landscape prints with descriptions of these places and things. So when he arrives in Long Island, he brings with him kind of this rich tradition of recording landscape, of talking about landscape, of the importance of sites and seeing places. So I think that he was always probably fascinated by photography. It had been invented before his birth, but during his lifetime is really when photographic technology developed to the point where the average person could go out and, if they get the right equipment, they could take photographs themselves. And he did. There's several photographs in collections throughout Long Island of him just photographing people in the community or buildings in the community, in addition to making artwork. So I think he probably saw his art making, his watercolors, his sketches, and his photography as two sides of the same coin, really. As Lauren pointed out, though, he quickly learned that he could use photography to his benefit by literally photocopying his artworks and then selling those copies. And so I think it was a lot of things. He was fascinated by it, and I think he realized he could apply that to make his business model more successful as well.
Do you see any evidence or thought that he was using photographs as an aid to the drawing, to the painting, like as a model or not to say copying, but...
Yeah, it's a good question. I know at least of one PhD student who's writing a dissertation on a very similar topic. It's widely discussed among our historians how it was used as a view-finding tool, which I think where your question was heading. I'm not sure if he did necessarily, or if he did, it might have just been because this technology was a part of his life, and so he was used to seeing the landscape through both a camera lens and through his own eyes as an artist, through the mindset of somebody who's been around printmaking and sketching his whole life. And so whether or not he actively thought about using it as a tool to help him with his artwork, I'm not sure. But it was definitely a part of how he viewed things in the world. And so it definitely had an influence on how he made art.
And would you say, I know we mentioned the Argyle Hotel in Babylon, but was he mostly a North Shore painter in terms of his subjects?
No, I mean, he's really painting across the region from, Jamaica, Queens to Shelter Island. So places all along the North Shore. And of course, some of the really big hotels are on the South Shore and in Babylon and Bayshore. So he's really across the island.
I think a lot of his residential pictures, so pictures of people's houses and things that tend to look like they're more out in the country, those are his neighbors primarily. And in his early years, he's painting the folks that live down the street from him, painting their houses. And then he expands outwards, I think, as he gains confidence and as he gains some degree of fame on Long Island, you could say. Expands outwards and starts traveling more. And yeah, he's traveling where the businesses are, which, much like today, tend to be along the north and south shores.
And is able to do more traveling because of also the expansion of the Long Island Railroad at this time as well.
So it all fits together, yeah.
Going out to the East End, yep.
And you just, since you mentioned the house portraits were a thing, was that people would say, hey, I want to remember my house, so hire someone to paint a picture?
It was definitely a trend throughout 19th century landscape artwork. I'm thinking of some of the works of Thomas Cole, described by many as the father, so-called father of American landscape painting, although he was a British immigrant as well. But I'm thinking of pictures that he did in upstate New York for folks with large properties and big houses. These are, it's a later generation, but the same kind of trend. I think that Lange is falling into. And another part of our research that could use more research in the future is his connections with the real estate industry. And so I suspect that a lot of these pictures are painted for folks that just want a picture of their property to put up at their house. But I suspect that some of them were also painted because owners of properties wanted to sell their properties and needed to advertise that. And what happened with the original picture afterwards, who knows? It probably went up in their house. But I do suspect that he was involved in the dealing of land and properties and houses, at least as the intermediary that was helping market these things and advertise them.
So what can you say about why he left Long Island?
I think he wanted more out of the business that he was getting. And I think he might have felt like he had exhausted his options on Long Island because he's not living in the city. At one point, he does try to move his family to Brooklyn, presumably to get closer to sort of the urban metropolis, more people, more business opportunities, perhaps. And they move out there briefly. And his young daughter actually dies of scarlet fever during just a brief 2-month move into the city. And they moved in the winter. Probably not a good idea to move to the city during the winter. You're going to be in closed spaces in a climate with a lot more people than you're used to. And one of his children died because of it. They moved back out to Long Island. So I think that when he was out in the country here, he's competing with the entire market of New York City and all the artists who do live there. And I think he looked west as, this is the 1880s. And by the time he's moving and the United States has expanded all the way to the West Coast. But there seems to be a lot more opportunity out on the West Coast because markets are not as firm. I mean, New York City is an established scene at this point for artists, for business people. On the West Coast, perhaps it seemed like there was more opportunity. And so he traveled out west with his family, likely just in search of better business opportunities.
Yeah, there's a lot more opportunity there for him to do more of what he was doing here in terms of growth of business and land speculation and all those sorts of things. And the only thing we really know about what Lange thought about Long Island does come from that letter that he sends to Carl Burr from Washington State. And he reflects on his time here. And I think felt that he didn't ever feel like he really belonged here in terms of, he was an immigrant artist who came here with skills, like many German immigrants to New York in the late 19th century, is not moving to the Lower East Side, but, his family owned property out in the Comac area and saw himself above the laboring class of people on Long Island, but also felt looked down upon from people like Carl Burr, his wealthier neighbors or more established Long Island families. And so feels that, he never truly found his place or felt respected on Long Island.
I mean, what's interesting, Peter, you mentioned he tried a shot at Brooklyn and left. And I know Mount moved back to Long Island. So was Long Island a fertile ground for artists or a place they went to be where they were kind of forgotten, or like in the interplay between the art world at the time and New York versus Long Island, were they worlds apart?
Edward Lange moved when he was 24, and he immediately basically inherited 100 plus acres of farmland in Comac that we assume already had a house on it. And he's 24. I mean, he he's got a pretty good situation set up for him right when he immigrates. As Lauren said, he doesn't have to go live in a tenement in the Lower East Side and scrounge together money until he can afford to move out of the city. So I think in part, he's got a really good setup here. And I think he is inspired by the country, the landscape. I mean, the first things he paints are these pastoral scenes, and it must have been quite beautiful to his eyes. But even over the time that he spent on Long Island's identity in the art community changed pretty dramatically. And I'll let Lauren explain some of that.
Yeah, so Edward Lange is a part of this long list of artists who were inspired by Long Island's natural beauty and its landscapes. And a group in particular that we discuss in the publication is the Tile Club, which is this group of really well-known artists of the time, folks like Winslow Homer, Thomas Moran, William Merritt Chase, people who all, get together in this group, and they create these really fantastical narratives of their travels around to different places of recreation and leisure. And they specifically visit Long Island in 1878. They are doing this trip ostensibly in search of artistic inspiration, and they call themselves the Tile Club, and they all have names like Polyphemus, and they're in search of artistic inspiration, and they create these picturesque views, and they have their journey then published in Scribner's Monthly. And so this is an illustrated periodical that Edward Lange definitely would have been familiar with. And so, there are many artists who are coming out to Long Island who depict Long Island's landmarks and natural beauty, and really are integral in promoting this region to people outside and really creating this visual identity for Long Island.
And I'll add as well, on top of this fanciful story coming out that readers love, at the center of it is William Laffin, who's an agent for the Long Island Railroad. And so on the surface, this is just a fun, fanciful trip by a bunch of creative individuals, and yet its deeper meaning is to publicize and promote new transportation opportunities on Long Island that more people can access and get to. And so I think Long Island's a lot of things. It is an inspiration for artists. It is a beautiful space. It's also a growing tourist market. And so, there is business sense behind a lot of the promotion of Long Island. And as visual artists are the ones who are tied into actually promoting that material to the public.
Yeah. It's a place of economic opportunity. So William Laffin, who's actually, his appellation is Polyphemus in the Tile Club narratives, he also publishes another book that is with the Long Island Railroad, which is called The New Long Island. And it's all about promoting this place as a place to live permanently, as a place to visit, and really, helping the Long Island Railroad also grow and expand at the same time.
I got to say, landscape artists paint themselves as these creative geniuses. But at the end of the day, they need to sell paintings to people to make a living. And in this case, they need to advertise places in order to make a living. And so while there's the creative mind on the surface, underneath is a business professional who needs to take home money at the end of the day. And I love watching artists, not just Lange, but others, flip back and forth between those two personas as they need to based on who their audience is.
So I don't want to keep you much longer. Let's just repeat. So where can people go to see the exhibit?
Yeah, so they can see the exhibition at our museum gallery in Cold Spring Harbor, which is right on Main Street. And that will be up until December 1st, and it's open from Friday through Thursday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m.
And the panel talk you're describing, that's coming up in November?
Yep, November 16th.
Great. And there'll be books to have signed? You'll have books there for people?
We sure will. And folks who attend the panel discussion will receive 30% off the book, if that's not enough of an enticement. But otherwise, the book is available for purchase on our website and at some local independent bookstores as well.
And thank you again to Lauren and Peter. We were talking on Libsyn Connect. If you don't know much about Edward Lange, if this is the first time you're hearing of him or his art, definitely check our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org to find more information on the events surrounding the launch of the book and the exhibit at Preservation Long Island. You still have time to check it out and make sure you take a look. And if you've done your own research into Long Island history, if you'd like to share a story or a personal connection or a family connection, get in touch with us at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. We're always looking for people with stories to tell, always looking to expand our own knowledge and share what we've learned. But that will do it for today's episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.